Hi, we come to the end of 1 Samuel 17 today with a passage that has baffled some scholars over the centuries, really, but especially in the era since modern biblical criticism has developed, because it appears at the very end that neither Saul nor the chief of his army, Abner, have any idea who this young man is who's just defeated their enemy's champion. And so that's led many scholars, of course, in the 19th century especially, to see this as evidence of different sources, that the whole story in this chapter is from a later source that seemingly doesn't know chapter 16, where David has been introduced to Saul twice already. And in fact, in this chapter where he was introduced earlier, and they had a conversation about whether he was qualified and capable of taking on Goliath. But as so often the case, and I first discovered this in my own work on John's Gospel over 3 decades ago now, that often going to the idea there are different sources is a function of just not continuing to read deeply enough and long enough to figure out how these ancient writers put their story together. Because as we'll see, the ending of this story, whether we see it as an epilogue or a postscript, is a brilliant segue between the defeat of Goliath and the movement toward the battle between Saul and David, where Saul's son Jonathan will quickly side with David, in fact, in the very next verse, the first verse of chapter 18. So let's jump in and look at this. As we've been looking at the chiasm in 1 Samuel 17, we note our passage today, starting in verse 55, does fall outside of this chiasm. So that's what makes it seem like it's some kind of footnote or epilogue. But as we'll see, it's joined together within itself, not chiastically, but around the theme of sons and young men. And so I produced this chart here to give us some way to look into this. And it goes back to what Polson pointed out, one of the great interpreters of the whole books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, in his first of 3 volumes on this, where back in the original first chapter here, he sees the story of Elkanah and his 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah, as a little parable or allegory about the monarchy, with Elkanah as a stand-in for Yahweh and sons as a stand-in for kings. And so he says to her, who's sad about not having a child, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not worth more to you than 10 sons? And so if we follow Polson there, sons do represent kings. And we'll see much later in the monarchy in 1 Kings 3, where the newly enshrined King Solomon negotiates a dispute between 2 mothers and their 2 sons. And there we'll see whether it's about kings or something else, but we have a ways to go. So throughout, from 1 Samuel all the way through at least 1 Kings 3, sons play a symbolic role, but also a literal role. David obviously is literally the son of Jesse, as we know, and the question is, will he move into becoming the metaphorical son of Saul or not? So let's look immediately at our passage, and then we'll look at the theme on the right side as we go. So one of the things that leads scholars, and I think rightly, to see this section as a combination of flashback and return to the present is the initial phrase here. When Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, that plainly was much earlier in the story. Obviously, if I just scroll back up a verse here, we see that the place we are in the story is that Goliath is dead. David has taken his head and put it in Jerusalem, as problematic as that is, but that's not the point for right now. And so he's defeated David and he's returned. And now when Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, it's a flashback. So we're going back to this first moment after their conversation, and then he said to Abner, the commander of the army. Abner we last saw in 1450 and 51 only once referred to in a narrator's summary of Saul's regime, and this is his first live appearance. As Bodner notes below, Abner's interests are most threatened by a rival. Saul is warning Abner about this rival, but Abner misses the signal. This is the first of several miscalculations on Abner's part. And I want to highlight that right away because this little passage here is as much about Saul and Abner as it is about David and anything else. It's how are they going to respond to this reality that there's a successful young man who could defeat Goliath doing something the king should have done, or perhaps Abner should have led troops in doing, and both of them are on the sidelines wondering who this man is. The man who is a hero is also a rival. And we'll see that in the beginning of chapter 18, where after the first scene where Jonathan's life is bound to David's, the women of the street will proclaim and sing and dance, Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands, and Saul will become angry. So really in the very next scene, we'll see the expression of Saul's anger that David is getting more popular than he was. And so this little scene here is a setup for that, to see whether Saul can keep David under control or not. So he asks Abner, the commander, Sebaoth here. So Sebaoth, as we saw, was the hosts of the Yahweh of hosts, but this is the earthly army. And Sar is a standard image we'll see a number of times, whether Egyptians or Babylonians or others in the Bible for a military leader. So he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this young man? We need to look at each detail of that. It's using hazeh here, the demonstrative pronoun, which has had a negative connotation, certainly referring to this Philistine, we saw a number of times. And so as Polza notes below here, suggesting that Saul's inquiry includes derision at the idea that this quote-unquote youth, this stripling, which we see in the next verse, could deliver Israel. So in other words, just as he has been successful against Goliath, Saul is trying to remember he's just a young man. And Abner says, in a terrible translation from the New RSV, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. Let's just emphasize this as strongly as I can. There is no notion of soul in the Hebrew Bible, period. The notion of soul is only introduced into the Jewish and Christian tradition through Platonism in the era after the New Testament, where it certainly is an important part of the Platonic view that overwhelms the Bible as becoming the basis for the new religion, not invented by Jesus, but invented by Greco-Roman philosophers called Christianity. But the Hebrew Bible knows nothing about that. In Genesis 2:7, humans consist of earth stuff and God's spirit. So there is no separate eternal soul, and this is just wrong. The word nephesh means life, and a nefesh is any living being. So in theology, we think of only humans having souls, but in the Bible, all living beings have nefesh. It's the breath of life that makes them living beings. So as we could translate this rather, on your life, O king, I do not know, is much closer to the reality. But I want to emphasize that because it's going to be a key word. We won't see it here, but in the next scene, 3 times in 18:1 and then again in 18:3. So since the original had no chapters, and this is outside the chiasm that linked verses 1 to 54 together, we can see this really as the segue between the battle against Goliath and the question of battle over loyalty to Saul or not. And so Abner doesn't know. So the first thing that Abner speaks out loud in the text is, O king, I do not know. As Falkman notes below, Abner must function in his impotence as the general who has no notion of the greatness and destiny of David. Notice that Abner refers to him as king, not as Saul. He's called king twice in succession here, underscoring what's at stake. And there was only one other time, that was in 7:25, when the people and the crowd said, the king will enrich whoever kills this Philistine. And so this is the only time anybody's referring to him directly as, O king. And so now the narrator joins in. Notice he was Saul here, and now the king here to underscore the point that it's kingship that's at issue. So he continues here, and there's a wonderful wordplay here, basically to Saul, whose son this is. Sha'al, to inquire, to ask, is the verb sha'al, and here in the form she'al. But basically, he's Sauling whose son this person is, which makes for a nice wordplay. The word for stripling here is unique here with only one exception, LM. Only in 2022 is it elsewhere. So this is similar to what he asked here, but using a slightly different words and to make the wordplay. So this was all the flashback. Verses 55 and 56 was the flashback to when David had gone out, and while he's going out, the king and his commander are having this conversation. But now, the narrator notes, on David's return from killing the Philistine. So that flashback is now joined here to highlight that Abner didn't do his job. It says, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. But his task was to find out, inquire to Sha'al whose son he is, and he didn't do that. He just found him. Notice the emphasis on take, and we'll see take again here in the next verse or two, beyond the scope of what we're going to look at today. What kings do is take, and what kings' peoples do is take. So Abner took him. Notice we don't see any sense of whether David consents or what basis Abner had for telling David, come with me. So he took him and brought him before Saul. Notice not the king again, but before Saul, with the head of the Philistine in his hand. What a grotesque image that is. In the art we saw last last video, there were a number of classic Renaissance paintings that showed the head of Philistine as gigantic, larger than like a beach ball. And although we're not to take that literally, so if we have that kind of image in our head, somehow that on the hand of this young man is absurd and grotesque. And it's also contrary to what we saw that he'd taken the head and brought it to Jerusalem. But we won't worry about that detail right now. Notice in his hand, which is a hand theme we'll see, we saw in chapter 17 how many times hand came up, and will continue throughout. So the hand theme is one we'll point out all the way. And so now Saul speaks directly to him in this verse. And as Bodner notes, perhaps Saul doesn't recognize David because he has, quote, turned into another man. And that's one way to interpret this, but it's not the only one. And there's the note that Abner failed to follow his instructions. So he says to him directly, notice for the third time, whose son? Whose son are you, young man? Using Na'ar here. And my note here down below, which is from Polson, that's worth paying attention to. Saul's question to David, therefore, is a compelling directive for the youth to call him father, just as he later would call David's son in 24:16. At the same time, it recalls Samuel's warning about the future actions of the king requested by the people. He will take your sons and he will appoint them for himself to commanders of thousands. So there's also the question of loyalty. Will David remain with his family or become part of Saul's household? And so that's what's at stake here. And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Notice not I was, but I am. So he's claiming that, and when we look at our chart in a minute, we'll see the framing of that. But there's an irony, or perhaps not an irony, ambiguity around a servant here. Your servant Jesse only goes back to 16:15 with Saul's servants, but one of the issues is Saul has no authority over Bethlehem. Bethlehem is not part of Israel, at least not formally. Bethlehem has been named as part of Judah in one of the rare references to Judah earlier in this sequence, and so we know that actually Saul has no authority over Bethlehem and therefore no authority over Jesse. But David suggests here that Jesse, at least Jesse, is a servant of David, putting David at least within the penumbra of the shadow of Saul's reign. And so with all that in mind, let's look at this chart to see if we can make sense of what's going on and what the theme of our story is after the dispatching of Goliath. So we already looked at this question of sons being worth more than Yahweh or not. And so we saw at the beginning of chapter 16, Jesse the Bethlehemite, and we see at the very end, Jesse the Bethlehemite. So framing this entire chapter, 2 chapters. And I put all the references to Jesse in black and the references to Saul in the royal purple here. And we see how many there are to Jesse in the first part of this and how it moves towards Saul, and yet it ends with Jesse. So David has not said he's going to be the son of Saul, and we have every reason to think that David, who plays his thoughts close to his vest, and we'll see a number of times where David explicitly is said to hide his feelings or his intentions. That's part of what makes him a good politician, is it's not clear what his stance is, and he can use that as a weapon because knowledge is power then and now. But we can see that he knows that Saul should have gone out to take on Goliath, or at least his army should have, and at least Abner should have, but instead they sent a young man who had experience at killing bears and lions, and that was the best they could do. And it was good enough, of course, he was able to do it with his one smooth stone. But that certainly would suggest to David that Saul and Abner are not good leaders and are not capable of doing what's certainly going to need to be done. The Philistines are certainly going to be coming back. And so this is going to set up throughout the rest of this book a rivalry between David and Saul that will have great drama in it, and we'll have to be asking, where is Yahweh in the midst of that? But while we do, just to complete this, notice the role of Na'ar here throughout as well. So both the Philistine and Saul disdain him or question him as a Na'ar, and that's the term that comes up at the end twice. 2 out of the 3 questions are Na'ar. And we could say there's a little ABA chiasm here in the 3 forms of the question. But in any event, the key is not just that whether he's the son, but that he's young. He's young enough to require control by somebody else. And we'll see momentarily that not only will David not be under Saul's control, Saul's actual biological son, Jonathan, will favor David and leave his father behind, and leave his potential inheritance as the successor king behind. And we'll see that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.